How do you do? We feel it would be a little unkind to present this picture without just a word of friendly warning. We are about to unfold the legacy of Dr. Alzheimer, a man of science whose name is one of the most frightening in the history of medicine. It is one of the strangest tales ever told. It deals with one of life's universal mysteries, the terrifying possibility of losing your mind as you grow old. We think it will surprise you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you. So, it may be of comfort to remember that our nightmares, no matter how frightening, are not always totally true.
What was it? Where did it come from?
So if what I've told you sounds like an asteroid about to hit the Earth's surface and would kill 100 million people, in 2050, 100 million people will have Alzheimer's disease. It's a fatal disease.
We have 71 million baby boomers heading toward risk age, and we have no way to effectively stop this disease. We're headed for catastrophe, global catastrophe.
To a disease that is going to be like a plague. It's going to be worse than AIDS, much worse.
I tell you, gentlemen, science has agreed that unless something is done and done quickly, man, as the dominant species of life on Earth, will be extinct.
The reality is, if we don't find a way to prevent Alzheimer's disease, we are going to see in most of the cities of the world demented people wandering the streets.
It would be terrible. It would be a terrible place. It would be like the medieval times. It's the worst plague that we can imagine.
We know we've only got about 40 years to solve this problem, or we've all had it.
Now we need to launch a very concerted effort, something like Manhattan Project.
We interrupt this bleak forecast to bring you a CNN special report from over 30 years ago. Senior medical correspondent Jean Carper.
In this special report, we examine the nature of that disease known as senility, what causes it, and some of the very real possibilities for curing it.
Shakespeare called it our seventh age of second childishness known as senility.
But Shakespeare was wrong. Doctors now know that senility is not an inevitable consequence of aging. It's a specific disease with a specific cause and therefore a possible cure.
They fully expect to conquer it.
And we're quite certain that we will.
Certainly.
I have no doubts about it.
I could maybe say in a decade or so.
I'm sure that within the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to find a way to treat the disease.
For centuries, scientists did not investigate senility because they thought it was utterly hopeless, until a doctor named Alois Alzheimer came along. In 1906, Dr. Alzheimer did autopsies. He found strange brain damage. This peculiar kind of brain damage is now known as Alzheimer's disease. A half a century later, researchers began to notice identical brain damage in the elderly with senility. Many now believe that if they can cure Alzheimer's disease, they will solve the age-old mystery of senility.
Unraveling the mystery of senility is exceedingly complex, but scientists now know it's not impossible. They've learned more about this disease in the last few years than in our entire human history. Mainly, that it is a disease and that someday, in the near future, they will be able to conquer it. Jean Carper, CNN, Washington.
Here I am today, 30-some years later. I'm now in my 80s.
Hey, doctor, thanks for calling me back. Tell me a little bit more about the study.
Yeah, 30 years later, I'm still on the Alzheimer's story. But now it's a lot more scary. I'm old, in my prime for getting Alzheimer's and other dementias. And the world is in a panic over predictions that Alzheimer's will be a demographic apocalypse by 2050, with more than 135 million people projected to have dementia. It feels to me like we're living in a long-running science fiction horror disaster movie. I suppose I have to say I'm obsessed about Alzheimer's. I'm always reading the latest studies. I run off to conferences to meet experts from all over the world, listening in on their sessions when I can, getting invited to their homes, even into an autopsy room. I've met so many researchers. I sometimes refer to myself as an Alzheimer's researcher groupie. The people studying dementia are so fascinating. They always have surprising news. Of course, I'm also always asking them about myself, trying to find out how to avoid Alzheimer's. Obviously, I'm under journalistic cover. A health reporter for 50 years, columns, articles, CNN, 24 books. One about the brain, another about Alzheimer's. Now I'm doing my first documentary.
Maybe I'm so passionate about this because when I think back on it, I was one of the media people at that time who became part of the propaganda machine to sell Alzheimer's to the public. Now, it has become a household word of fear and terror and dread in the last 30 years.
How did that happen?
How does that happen?
It's the worst possible thing I think anybody can imagine, and the most terrifying.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, you know how scared I've been.
I was born January 3rd, 1932, in Ashley, Ohio. It's a small town. All my ancestors were farmers. My father, my mother. I was the first child, then a brother, 2 sisters, and another brother. Dad bought our house during the Depression. I was a happy child, with a neighborhood of kids to play with. But what I loved most was going to the movies at the Strand Theater.
Might even horrify.
I was about 7 when I saw the 1931 classic Frankenstein. Afterward, I had terrible nightmares.
No, you're hurting me! No!
I still remember lying in the dark in my upstairs bedroom, paralyzed with fear. I could hear the Frankenstein monster come up the stairs and down the hall and stop right outside my bedroom door. And I'd wake up screaming. Of course, the childhood nightmares eventually stopped. Then, a very odd thing happened almost 75 years later. About a year before my 80th birthday, I began having nightmares again. This time, the monster was not Frankenstein. I was in a crowd of people all wearing shrouds, like in the Middle Ages, the Black Death. Then I would see Dr. Alzheimer calling to me. In a kind of trance, I would go stand in front of him. He would tilt my head back, like he was looking for something inside my brain, and whisper, "Yes, you are one of my chosen." And then I would wake up in a panic, absolutely terrified that I was dying. It is a lot more scary than when I was a child, because I know this nightmare could become real.
Would all of you who will be 80 years or older by 2050 please raise your hand? The good news is if you make it that far, you know, that's wonderful. The bad news is 1 out of every 2 of you who raised your hands will have Alzheimer's disease.
The Alzheimer's story begins at the turn of the 20th century in this magnificent mental asylum called the Castle of the Insane. This is where a young psychiatrist met a 51-year-old demented patient who died with unusual plaques and tangles in her brain. The doctor's colleagues named her affliction Alzheimer's disease. It was extremely rare, never mentioned in his obituaries, and its importance seemed destined to be buried with him. Then, about 60 years later, Alzheimer's disease was resurrected. It happened at the National Institutes of Health. In the late 1970s, Zaven Khachaturian came to NIH to become chief architect of a plan to put Alzheimer's disease on the map.
The entity, the phenomena of dementia was known. It's been known since the ancients. Greeks knew about it, and Shakespeare wrote about it in As You Like It. But the scientific medical community did not consider it a disease. They considered it as part of the natural consequence of aging.
But aging wasn't a very sexy topic.
It was not. That was part of the problem.
Alzheimer's is sexy and exciting.
Now it is, but at that time it was not. It was not known. It was not called Alzheimer's disease, it was called senility. So one of the tasks in making it exciting was to change the terminology, to change the term from dementia, from senility, get the word senility out of the lexicon, and call it Alzheimer's disease.
All of a sudden, there's this new disease that no one had heard of before. So really, it was a matter of renaming a phenomena that had been going on for a long time.
Would you say then you were quite a salesman selling?
Oh, absolutely. That was my role, was to be a cheerleader, salesman. My job was to develop a national program to put Alzheimer's research, brain aging on the map.
And he succeeded brilliantly, working closely with Dr. Robert Butler. They recruited top scientists for credibility. They persuaded Congress and Big Pharma to invest billions in the search for a cure.
So quite a bit of effort was done to get Wall Street Journal, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post to do stories on Alzheimer's.
In 1980, the Alzheimer's Association was formed. They got the blessing of President Ronald Reagan.
And in 1982, he signed a proclamation to recognize that there is this entity called Alzheimer's. Then ironic that he eventually developed himself.
The marketing of Alzheimer's, also called raising awareness, spread all around the world. Over 100 countries now have Alzheimer's associations.
How successful would you say your salesmanship was at selling Alzheimer's disease to the public and the Congress and, in fact, the whole world?
I did not realize how successful I was being, or in fact, I was often very frustrated that wasn't going enough.
Wouldn't you say that the idea is a major change in the way we view senility and dementia? I mean, in only 30 years.
That's true. It's a very dramatic change. Giving it a name, giving it a face, saying that it's a disease that we're working towards treatment became a rewarding in itself, that you were providing some degree of hope.
From the beginning, fear became part of legitimizing Alzheimer's.
You've got to show that this causes real suffering. And so there's an increasingly a representation of just how devastating this disease is. And and when I say this, and I call it a political strategy, I don't mean to minimize the very real suffering that dementia can cause. On the other hand, you know, to start using terms that they created, like the funeral that never ends, you know, the long goodbye, the argument, the claim that it destroys the selfhood of people, and that the cruelest thing is that people go on living and living, you know, just a hollow shell and so forth. I mean, this is extremely radically stigmatizing language that starts to create much, much more fear around these symptoms. That's the kind of fear that that this campaign, this strategy to put Alzheimer's on the map generates.
Which disease are you most afraid of? A new survey by the Marist Institute asked people that question, and the #1 response was Alzheimer's disease.
It's pretty terrible. People really deteriorate, and it gets really bad.
I think it's tragic.
I think it's a terrible disease. My mom died from it.
Our greatest fears are all around us, hiding in nightmares.
Even the king of horror calls Alzheimer's his worst fear.
At my age, I'm afraid of Alzheimer's, dementia, declining intellectual ability.
Here's the movie that scared me the most in the last 12 or 13 years. The movie opens with a woman in late middle age sitting at a table and writing a story. That's Iris Murdoch, and she's suffering the onset of Alzheimer's disease. That's the boogeyman in the closet now.
Night of the Living Dead could actually be seen today as a portrait of how we view Alzheimer's patients.
Political scientist Susan Bihuniak says that using the zombie image to describe Alzheimer's patients amplifies fear and stigma around the disease.
It's academics, it's scholars, and it's people in the medical profession. When they speak of people with Alzheimer's, they talk about people living in the twilight. They talk about the undead. They are referencing it in a way that it invokes in us, without it being specifically mentioned, the image of a zombie. We're dehumanizing them, we are marginalizing them, and we're making it easy to treat them as if they're already dead when they're not. And we like to segregate the people who are stigmatized.
I believe that our communities dehumanize people with dementia and exclude them from, isolate them, put them away, whatever. And the consequences of our actions as human beings to dehumanize a group of us dehumanizes everybody.
Pat, this is Andreas, who says, I have a friend whose wife suffers from Alzheimer's. He started seeing another woman.
I hate Alzheimer's. It is one of the most awful things, because here's the loved one. This is the woman or man that you have loved for 20, 30, 40 years, and suddenly that person is gone. They're gone. They are gone. I know it sounds cruel, but if he's going to do something, he should divorce her and start all over again.
On Monday, a retired doctor and euthanasia advocate used a machine he invented to help a 54-year-old woman take her life. The woman, Janet Adkins of Portland, Oregon, was diagnosed as having Alzheimer's disease and wanted to end her life. Mrs. Adkins traveled to Michigan, where Dr. Jack Kevorkian, a retired pathologist, connected her to his invention. Mrs. Adkins' suicide took place in Kevorkian's van in a local park.
What appears to have happened there was she was so frightened of the prospect of what would happen to her once she had got this label of Alzheimer's disease that she couldn't enjoy what was a really, by all accounts, still a pretty good life with possibly quite a few really good years to enjoy.
Ralph Nader is concerned about such suicides after a personal loss.
You're going to see more suicides as a result of the incipient fear of being labeled an Alzheimer's person in the coming years. In fact, the suicide levels are already going up with the older baby boomers. A very distinguished lawyer in his mid to late 80s, and we used to consult him, and he came through 100%, and he shot himself. Clearly, he was not incapacitated. Part of that was due to one of his relatives had Alzheimer's, and you know, this genetic destiny that's crowding people now more and more is affecting people's judgment at a very early and premature time, I think.
Alzheimer's is a global nightmare. A diagnosis is frightening in any language, even if it's not true. A few years ago, Emma Drost, a medical malpractice lawyer, discovered that a neurologist at a local hospital was misdiagnosing Alzheimer's and similar brain diseases on a grand scale.
Well, it is a very big scandal. I think globally, I think there is no comparison. I think this is probably the biggest case ever of misdiagnosis.
In front of me, I think it's 20% of all the files in the case of Dr. Janssen Steur, a neurologist. He told them that they have Alzheimer's.
Some of the patients immediately quit their job, sold their house, made arrangements to go for a nursing home.
Some went to Shelton's VU Medical Center for a second opinion.
I was really horrified what I saw.
One woman's case was so remarkable that Dr. Shelton's colleagues wrote about it in a medical journal.
So it says planting a misdiagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in a person's mind.
And she really began to believe that she did have Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
Mrs. Dommick developed memory loss and other Alzheimer's-like symptoms. It was difficult for doctors to persuade her that she did not have Alzheimer's and that her memory problems were due mostly to mild depression.
She was very upset because her mother was also suffering Alzheimer's.
She struggled with severe anxiety for nearly 10 years and was under psychiatric care. She even considered euthanasia, legal in the Netherlands.
Het was hel. Het was heel verschrikkelijk. Zo verschrikkelijk veel gebeurd. Dit vergeet je gewoon je hele leven niet meer. Het loopt met je mee.
Freddy de Haan is a man who heard he had a very aggressive form of Alzheimer, that he had a very short time to live.
Ik verloor mijn huis. Met verlies. Ik heb wel een huis terug. Mijn zoon is opgehouden met studeren. Uiteindelijk heb ik mijn vrouw verloren. Ja.
De Haan planned to kill himself by driving into this bridge, but was saved by a second opinion.
He had a treatable form of epilepsy.
Wim van Lasser was suffering from stress and depression when he was misdiagnosed with Alzheimer's. Dr. Steur told him he had only 6 months of normal functioning left.
I was shocked. Ja. Want mijn wijf ook. Mijn vrouw ook.
He sold his house, moved in with his daughter, stopped working.
Ja, erg. Dat was heel erg. Maar ook... ik had alles achter mij verbrand. En dat was voor niks geweest.
One of my clients committed suicide after she heard that she had Alzheimer's. When the total story came in the Dutch media, the family asked for the medical file of their mother. Their mother was totally healthy. It's a tragedy.
Drost got financial compensation for many victims, from $10,000 to $250,000.
It will never cover their suffering.
In 2013, Dr. Janssen Steur was convicted of medical malpractice causing bodily harm and death. He appealed a 3-year prison sentence. His defense, personality disorder and addiction to narcotics. Should be pretty easy to tell if you have Alzheimer's, right? If your brain is normal or abnormal.
So the claims are that the diagnosis of Alzheimer's has become highly accurate, something on the order of 90% accuracy. My impression is that people get a diagnosis too easily, too quickly. And the notion that it's, 90% accurate, I find highly questionable.
Lon White has the facts about that. For 20 years, he was chief investigator of the Honolulu Asian Aging Study, funded by the National Institutes of Health.
We use the best available diagnostic criteria. We have now looked at 852 brains of the individuals in the study. So what we basically asked was, did we get it right? Only truly about a third of them were absolutely right on, perfect diagnoses. Another third, basically, yes, there were the Alzheimer changes, but there was something else that was a major contributor. And then the final third had something completely different in their brain. So what that means is that as hard as we tried, somewhere only between a third and half were we really right on. The reason it's alarming is not because you don't have a disease. You certainly have a dementing disease, but the underlying process driving it is not always what we really mean by Alzheimer's disease.
Claudia Kawas has studied Alzheimer's and dementia for 30-some years. She's tracking a large group of people over 90 in a so-called 90-plus study.
If I give a brain of a 95-year-old to a pathologist and say, based on what you see under the microscope, will this person be demented or not? They have only a 50-50 chance of being right, which means you can flip a coin. You don't have to do the autopsy.
So if Alzheimer's is only 1/3 to 1/2 of our dementia epidemic, shouldn't we worry about all the other monsters tromping through our aging brains? We're just calling it Alzheimer's when it's some other form of dementia.
The epidemic we're facing is not just pure Alzheimer's disease. We've used the term Alzheimer's when we really mean dementia in general.
Everybody has Alzheimerified the research field. We're saying that everything is Alzheimer's disease, and we're misdiagnosing the other stuff.
Peter Nelson has done hundreds of brain autopsies, and he's alarmed that Alzheimer's is routinely misdiagnosed.
It's actually true that dementia keeps going up. It's just not Alzheimer's disease, it's other diseases. In people over 85, Alzheimer's is almost never the only cause of impairment. 80% of people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's have other stuff too.
In the oldest old, Alzheimer's pathology actually goes down with age.
It really starts to ramp up at age 65 or 70, and then it sort of has an exponential growth. Then by 90 or 95, it's leveling off or decreasing. The people that are 95-year-old have less Alzheimer's type pathology than people that are 85 years old. A good 20% of people will have zero Alzheimer's disease at the very end of the aging spectrum. So it's incorrect to say that if you live old enough, you will get Alzheimer's disease. What is called Alzheimer's disease is actually a hodgepodge of different diseases. Every single human being when they're 90, 95 years old has some blood vessel pathology in the brain, every single one. In addition, something like 20-30% will have Lewy body disease. 20 to 25% will have a disease that almost nobody thinks about called hippocampal sclerosis of aging.
This is a newly discovered, ferocious dementia that attacks the oldest old.
It's always misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, always.
The most common dementia, probably at any age, is mixed dementia.
And how much of it is Alzheimer's?
40% Alzheimer's, 30% cerebrovascular, 20% hippocampal sclerosis, 10% DLB, dementia with Lewy bodies.
Surprisingly, non-Alzheimer's pathology seems more destructive. Dr. Kawas ranked 4 common brain pathologies on their likelihood of giving you dementia: Alzheimer's, microinfarcts, which are tiny strokes, vascular white matter disease, and hippocampal sclerosis.
Alzheimer's was the lowest. Having Alzheimer's pathology doubled your likelihood of having dementia, but everything else was 4 to 17 times the likelihood. Almost everybody who had white matter disease and hippocampal sclerosis had dementia. If I had to choose between one of those, give me Alzheimer's over hippocampal sclerosis. Much better odds.
Some pathologies that cause dementia have not even been identified.
We just don't know what it is. And that probably accounts of the cases we call Alzheimer's disease 5 or 10% of those are due to this mystery disease. We have to figure out what it is. When we initially started talking about this, we called it dementia X.
I would be loath to say that people shouldn't care about Alzheimer's disease. What is, I think, inappropriate is that they don't care about anything else.
So what if we had a cure for Alzheimer's tomorrow? How much difference would it make?
Be treating that 40% of people.
So we'd still be left with 60% of our dementia epidemic.
Yeah.
You know, if we don't face the reality of how complex this problem is, we're going to be stuck in this same position forever.
That old familiar tune of there's just one big Alzheimer's monster haunting our aging brains is beginning to sound more like
He did the monster mash. It was a graveyard smash.
Would you want to know how likely you are to ever have Alzheimer's? And if so, how you could find out? I tend toward wanting to know. The person I'm most eager to talk to about that is Dr. Margaret Locke. I consider Dr. Locke the high priestess of deep thoughts about Alzheimer's. She spent 10 years analyzing the medical, genetic, social, political, and historical aspects of Alzheimer's in her book titled The Alzheimer Conundrum. She is an intellectual giant on the subject, and I felt slightly intimidated at meeting her. But the first thing, she suggested making tea. Then we settled in for a chat that lasted over a couple of days.
The majority of us, when we want to know what's going to happen in the future, or when we want to account for what has happened in the past, would go to fortune tellers or soothsayers or shamans or oracles and so on. It's a form of divination. It seems to me that the idea of running to get genetic tests to predict whether you're going to get a disease or not is like getting a form of divination, because it's not going to tell you with any certainty. I think that this is what we're playing with here, that we cannot, with any certainty, predict who among us is likely to get Alzheimer's.
I didn't confess immediately that before meeting Dr. Locke, I had been dabbling in divination, both ancient and modern. I've had a couple of MRIs to measure the shrinkage in my brain, a PET scan to detect Alzheimer's plaque in my brain, consulted a psychic and a card reader. But I did tell Dr. Locke that I carry the #1 gene for old age Alzheimer's, called ApoE4. It showed up in a routine blood test, and there's good reason to be afraid.
And ApoE drives plaques and tangles and is just the great big thing in Alzheimer's disease in terms of causing the disease, unfortunately.
Most old people with Alzheimer's do carry the ApoE4 gene, and it causes Alzheimer's plaque in aging brains, doubling my chances of dementia. But it's not a doomsday gene. In some people, it may never kick in.
As many as 50% of those people will never get Alzheimer's. It depends on all sorts of things, like your diet, your lifelong diet and lifestyle, but it also depends on other things that we don't understand. We simply don't know enough to be able to predict.
Do you know whether or not you have an ApoE4?
I don't. I haven't had any of that testing.
You wouldn't want to know, or you think it's useless?
I wouldn't. I think it's useless.
I've noticed that Alzheimer's researchers seem oddly uninterested in testing themselves.
Do you know if you have an ApoE4?
I don't.
You don't have?
I don't know. I don't know.
Why don't you?
Why no?
Nothing is determined by the genes that are active in old age Alzheimer's. This is not a genetic disease. In other words, the genes that are implicated do not determine that you will get the disease.
Is Alzheimer's hereditary? What's the kind of quick answer to that?
Yes.
Time out. Both of them are right. They're talking about different types of Alzheimer's.
Most people are not aware that there are two forms, young and old age.
And there's a big difference. Young or early onset Alzheimer's is nearly always determined by genes. Old age Alzheimer's is not.
Early onset Alzheimer's is caused by single gene disorders. In other words, if you have one of these genes, you are at risk, great risk, for getting Alzheimer's early in your life.
Early being what age?
Usually it's 40s or going into the 50s. And it progresses very rapidly when you do get this condition, and you die young. You die in your 40s or 50s.
This is not the same disease as Alzheimer's at age 65 or 70 or 80 or 90.
No. And the most obvious difference is that early onset Alzheimer's, these single gene disorders, are disorders that clearly run in families. If you inherit one of these genes, then you will get the disease.
So this is a 100% mutation genetic disease.
Yes.
And it's very rare.
Yes, it is rare. The estimates vary, but it's something like between 2 and 5% of people who become labeled as Alzheimer's have the early onset.
But we think of young and old Alzheimer's as a single disease, and we commonly use early inherited Alzheimer's to exaggerate the fear of common old age Alzheimer's.
Me?
The glorious Rita Hayworth was the first poster child for old age Alzheimer's, even though she was stricken in her mid-50s. Most novels on dementia are about rare, more dramatic young age Alzheimer's. Dr. Locke showed me a novel titled Still Alice, a bestseller made into a movie. She praises it as an authentic portrayal of a woman diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at age 50, who dies within a year. But Dr. Locke worries that it could needlessly alarm elderly people.
There should have been some preface to say that this is a rare condition. This is not what happens to most people. Clearly, it isn't a suitable model for late onset Alzheimer's at all. Normally, the progression to advanced Alzheimer's and eventually death could take anything between 5 years up to sometimes even 20 years.
I think that what older people who read about Alzheimer's research think is that it's all determined by genes, it's all determined biology, and there's nothing they can do about it except support research.
And here's an incredible genetics mystery. Even having identical genes is not enough to predict old age Alzheimer's.
We did a study of identical twins, two men who grew up together. They went to college together to become chemical engineers. They died in their late 70s within a few years of each other. And one of the twins had florid Alzheimer's disease. The other twin had a brain that looked like the brain of a 40-year-old. The twin that had Alzheimer's disease had spent his career up to his elbows in DDT. We suspect very strongly that the exposure to DDT altered the epigenetics of the one twin so that he got Alzheimer's disease.
Epigenetics. It means everything you do, everything that happens to you, switches your genes on and off, affecting whether you get Alzheimer's, dementia, and other diseases.
So clearly, the genes you're born with are not destiny.
Exactly. Your genes are not your destiny. Your destiny is determined by the kind of life that you live.
We can only recommend genetic testing that's reliable for that maybe 2% of Alzheimer's that strikes under 60 years old, that involves these hard-hitting mutations.
How accurate is ApoE, the ApoE score in prediction of Alzheimer's?
It's not.
After reading your book, I decided that I would verify the other things that could be divination of predicting. So I had my tarot cards read.
I'm going to shuffle one last time. I'm going to say a little meditation in my head.
Tarot cards have been used over 500 years to predict illness.
I don't think that you have Alzheimer's, and I don't think that you'll have it. The page is always the harbinger of good news.
No Alzheimer's. I went to a psychic. I have the major gene for Alzheimer's in old age.
You won't get it. You won't get it.
No, no Alzheimer's.
Wonderful.
We've been waiting for a silver bullet to cure Alzheimer's for over 30 years. What happened?
There was a lot of excitement in the field about finding a drug because we didn't really have any drugs before that.
In the mid-1980s, Peter Whitehouse pioneered research leading to Alzheimer's drugs like Exelon and Aricept, and was a highly paid consultant for the pharmaceutical industry.
The sum total was several $million.
For 20 years, he was a loyal soldier for the idea that Alzheimer's is a treatable disease. Then Whitehouse went AWOL, very publicly. He wrote a controversial book called The Myth of Alzheimer's, arguing that old-age Alzheimer's is not a disease.
What we have now is, in my opinion, a fixation and a fantasy that we can cure what people call Alzheimer's, which I believe is just a number of forms of severe brain aging.
Dr. Peter Davies at Feinstein Institute in New York also helped discover Alzheimer's drugs. He was a rising star featured in my CNN documentary.
I used to be a young hotshot.
And now you're still a hotshot. We're
Well,
just 30 years older.
In the early 80s, we really had high hopes for what became Aricept, Exelon, Razodine, the drugs that are currently approved by the FDA.
I had to act. We talked to our doctor. He told us prescription Aricept is the only treatment proven effective for all stages of Alzheimer's.
But they were very disappointing.
Once they were out on the market, they were not very effective.
What percentage of the people who take these drugs would you say are actually have any kind of improvement?
10, 20% at most. And when there are effects, they're small effects usually.
There's been a complete shift in the way we're trying to treat the disease now. We are no longer trying to treat the symptoms of the disease. We're trying now to develop treatments that will attack the disease process, slow it, stop it, reverse it.
And how successful are they?
They haven't been successful so far.
Tens of billions of dollars, if not more, maybe $100 billion have been spent on trying to cure Alzheimer's. It is increasingly clear that that's not working.
People are very disturbed and unhappy about the tremendous number of failures, all the failures in the drug trials. I mean, there is no drug that effectively works to stop the progress of this disease.
But how can you cure something if you don't even know what causes it?
This is Elmer Davis again. We still don't know what it is or where it comes from, but there's something there.
That can't be true after more than 100 years. Somebody must know.
What causes Alzheimer's disease?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Yeah.
Do we know what the cause of Alzheimer's is?
The short and simple answer is no.
Nobody understands why this disease begins.
What causes Alzheimer's?
We don't know. That's my short answer.
What is the main factor driving Alzheimer's?
Age. I don't know why. I wish I did. I think that's Nobel Prize material.
Trying to imply that one thing causes Alzheimer's disease is really nonsense.
What causes Alzheimer's?
Karma.
We don't know enough yet. And basically, to plan a war when you don't know the strategy of what you do is foolish.
Since scientists aren't sure what causes Alzheimer's, they come up with a theory and try to prove it. For about 25 years, we've tested Alzheimer's drugs using the theory that it's caused by a brain protein called amyloid beta, the stuff in plaques. I couldn't wait to meet John Hardy, a prime author of this theory.
He's a very smart man. He set out the major hypothesis, which essentially said that the plaques are the cause.
Dr. Hardy is known for his casual attire, self-assurance, joking, and obvious brilliance. I first interviewed him at his son's apartment in Philadelphia.
You're the brains behind this whole thing, aren't you, the amyloid theory?
Well, one of the brains, perhaps.
Hardy became famous by discovering that rare gene mutations trigger an overproduction of brain amyloid in people who get early onset inherited Alzheimer's.
They get Alzheimer's disease because they make too much amyloid.
Then he made the big leap that for unknown reasons, amyloid also piles up in old brains, causing Alzheimer's.
Since we know amyloid causes the disease in these few cases of disease, isn't it simplest to have the hypothesis that amyloid causes the disease in all cases of the disease? And that is the amyloid hypothesis.
But it's a theory, isn't it?
It's a theory. Exactly, it's a theory. It's an unproven theory.
It's a guess.
I would put it a little bit stronger than saying it's a guess.
The amyloid theory came out in the early 90s, inciting a flood of anti-amyloid drugs to treat old age Alzheimer's. The recent failure rate was 99.6%. The man who drummed up millions at NIH to study amyloid now says he's lost faith.
Clearly, amyloid is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. This has created a scientific orthodoxy. It's like the Nicene Creed. Do you know the Nicene Creed? I believe in the Father, the Son, and Holy Ghost.
One reason to doubt the theory showed up in the famous nun study in the late 90s.
These are the names of 28 sisters in this building who are over 90. And you've got 6 sisters who are over 100.
Sister Esther has been at the convent since she retired 6 years ago, at the age of 96.
I'm 102.
The goal is to learn more about how conditions like Alzheimer's disease develop. In studying dozens of brains, Snowden made a remarkable discovery.
About half the sisters are mentally normal when they die. And what is quite surprising to us is we find a significant number of them have full-blown Alzheimer's disease in their brain, yet are acting normally.
The question is, if so many sisters' brains show evidence of Alzheimer's, why do so few of them have any of the memory loss?
An obvious possibility is that amyloid is not the main cause.
We need to think of other things besides amyloid.
That's precisely the point.
Yes, but the true believers in the amyloid theory still dominate Alzheimer's research, and they've already begun the boldest experiment ever. They're giving anti-amyloid drugs, no longer to cure Alzheimer's, but to prevent it. It's all based on a radical new concept called preclinical Alzheimer's. It means that brain plaque builds up for decades before causing any symptoms of dementia. If true, then why not try the drugs earlier to stop the plaque buildup and prevent dementia before it starts?
So that's absolutely correct, that about a third of individuals over the age of 65 have a head full of amyloid. It's just that the amyloid starts 10 or 20 years before you get dementia. And these people who are still normal, our studies thus far suggest they're not going to stay normal very long. The increased likelihood, if you have amyloid in your brain, of developing cognitive decline are 3 to 4 times higher.
People have the pathology for around 10 years before they manifest it clinically.
So would you say at that point they have Alzheimer's?
Yes.
Even long before they have any symptoms?
They have the pathology, they have the disease is there.
This would mean that you might be telling people at ages 45 and 50 that they have preclinical Alzheimer's. How scary is that?
We would have tens of millions of more people worried about whether they were going to come down with Alzheimer's. The purpose of a new diagnostic category is to identify people at the earliest possible stages so that they can be ready for the drug that is promised to come at some point that will
fix their problem.
We're right at the beginning of this shift to this new form of prevention.
Dr. Sperling is now going where others have never tread. She's conducting the first large-scale drug experiment to try to prevent old-age Alzheimer's.
He meddled in things men should leave alone. Just a scientific experiment at first, to do something no other men in the world had done.
How much money do you have for these studies?
Oh my goodness. It's well over a $100 million study and probably significantly more than that. So this trial is really designed to find individuals who have evidence of elevated amyloid plaque buildup, but don't yet have significant memory trouble. And our job is to try to slow decline so that ultimately we can prevent mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease dementia.
During the 3.5-year test, patients from ages 65 to 85 get infusions of antibodies to try to suck amyloid out of their brains and reduce its buildup.
And this doesn't mean we cure Alzheimer's disease. It means that people can live into their 80s and 90s and 100 and die out ballroom dancing instead of in a nursing home suffering from Alzheimer's disease.
At the same time, a large study in Colombia is trying to prevent early-age inherited Alzheimer's by giving similar anti-amyloid drugs.
So the fact that it didn't act as a treatment does not mean that it won't act as a preventive.
That's what I think.
The hazard in that is that we don't know whether the amyloid changes are the culprit or not, ultimately. We have to be really careful.
Removing the amyloid from normal people may actually cause them to become demented sooner or cause other abnormalities.
Would you want to take a drug that took amyloid out of your brain?
Not necessarily.
How likely are these drugs to stop or slow Alzheimer's on a scale of 1 to 10?
Well, I would say 8 or 9 in the early onset, and let's say 6 in the late onset.
I would put it around 3, 4.
So
Pretty
low.
Yeah, pretty low.
How likely do you think that we are going to have a magic pill that is going to eradicate Alzheimer's disease?
Less than 1%.
There's not going to be a silver bullet.
It's not likely that that magic bullet is going to come. If it comes and I'm wrong, guess I'll celebrate. But I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, a cure for Alzheimer's disease is currently science fiction.
By the time the study comes up with some answers, I'll be in my late 80s, still not really knowing how likely I am to get Alzheimer's. Christopher Rowe says a PET scan for brain amyloid will tell me.
If you have a positive scan with the amyloid and you don't have memory problems yet?
Be 10, 15 or more years away.
And if you have no amyloid in your brain at the age of 81?
I think it means you'll never get Alzheimer's disease.
But he warns me to expect the worst.
If you're 80, it's over 80% of people who carry the A4 will have amyloid plaques in their brain.
So I can wait for an autopsy, or I can find out now. I decide to go for the brain scan.
That was kind of brave of you to do that. I must say that I would not have done that. I would not have had a scan.
You don't really want to know how much amyloid you might have in your brain.
No, I would not want to know.
Oh, my.
The grand high-tech oracle of Delphi for Alzheimer's is a special PET scan invented by Chet Mathis and Bill Klunk at the University of Pittsburgh.
We're trying to do the same pathology, basically, that Dr. Alzheimer did, except we're trying to do it in living people.
Have you two used the PET scan on your own brains?
No.
So here I am, nervously waiting to surrender my brain to Eli Lilly's newly FDA-approved PET scan.
This is really a big deal because for years and years, the only way that you could ever find out if a person had Alzheimer's plaque in their brain is if you got a dead brain at autopsy, chopped it up, and then put it under a microscope. This is the very first time ever that they can do a scan that finds how much Alzheimer's type plaque you have in your brain with just the scan in a living brain. In this case, my brain. I'm not so sure why I ever said I really want to know this.
Okay,
Okay, Mrs. Carper, we're ready now for the scan. So you just do is sit right over here, and then lie down with the head here. Okay? Perfect, right there.
Well, I'm a little claustrophobic, but...
Okay, you have exactly 3 minutes and 30 seconds left. 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Remove the blindfolds. Lower the table down a little bit. Hold still for a second.
The die is cast. There's no going back. Now we'll know in a few hours how much plaque I really have in my brain. How close I am to Alzheimer's.
While we're waiting, I should tell you about a parallel universe where dementia researchers talk about more than genes and plaques and tangles and drug cures. Here, they're excited about how lifestyle and environment affect your chances of dementia. I found out about neurologist Majid Fatoui in a medical journal. He has a special program to help people like me who want to avoid dementia.
I'm not trying to cure Alzheimer's disease. My goal is to cure people's fear of Alzheimer's disease.
I was in his Baltimore office in a flash. Dr. Fatoui checked my neurological status.
I want you to hop on each foot 5 times. Do you like dancing?
I love dancing.
What's your favorite
Love
dance?
dancing. Well, you know, I learned the jitterbug in the 40s. I'm still doing it.
Now I'm going to give you something a little bit more difficult, okay?
I was awfully nervous about the short-term memory test.
I'm going to give you a long list of words. We just see how many you remember.
Hut, cow, lion, tiger, tent, hotel. Wait, cow and horse. Did I say cow and horse?
Your memory is excellent. Your cognitive abilities are really superior. And that's
Really?
quite amazing. Yes.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm surprised somehow.
One at a time.
Next, I got a special kind of EEG test.
Yes.
It was normal.
I bet I look funny.
You look like you're about to be sent up into space.
Now, the cardiac fitness test. I thought I'd do okay on it since I do get a lot of exercise.
All right, are you ready to get started? Oh my goodness. You're at 96% of your complete maximum, so whenever you need to stop, let me know.
I was totally shocked by the results.
And you're 182%. See? Occasionally someone is 100%, 110%. I think the highest I've seen is 120%.
I'm the highest you've seen now?
You're the highest fitness person we've seen here. Yes, and that explains why your memory is so good.
Well, that was definitely the highlight of the day.
I would love for people to stop worrying about Alzheimer's and get out there, improve their fitness, improve their sleep, reduce obesity, improve their cholesterol, improve blood flow to the brain, all the things that have been shown to be good for the brain.
Most important, Dr. Fatoui says, is stop your brain from shrinking. The bad news.
People develop memory loss with aging because the memory part of the brain, called hippocampus, shrinks by about 1% every 2 years after age 50. That's why they have memory loss.
The good news.
You can absolutely reduce the shrinkage in your hippocampus with your lifestyle choices. People should forget about Alzheimer's disease, and instead they should focus on things they can do to make their brains bigger and stronger and to prevent Alzheimer's disease in the first place.
Yes, like making your hippocampus into a stem cell lab to grow gazillions of new brain cells. The man to ask about that is Fred Rusty Gage. At the dawn of the third millennium, Gage walked into history with a eureka moment right out of the Twilight Zone. Gage found that you're not stuck with the number of brain cells you're born with. You constantly give birth to baby stem cells in your hippocampus. If nourished, they survive and grow into fully functioning neurons, enlarging your brain. This lifelong process is called neurogenesis.
There's somewhere between 700 and 1,000 new cells being born every day. We showed that there were new neurons that were born in the brains of humans out to the age of 40, 50 years old at least. I think the oldest was 72. It was quite exciting. It was actually quite exciting.
Gage first discovered neurogenesis in mice. He put one group of mice in Disneyland cages with exercise wheels and toys. He put other mice in small bear cages with little chance for stimulation. After a month, the non-stimulated mice had 300,000 neurons. The Disneyland mice had 50,000 more. The most famous proof of human neurogenesis was found in London taxi drivers. London cabbies must pass a rigorous test called the knowledge.
But what do you have to learn?
Everything.
Around 25,000 streets and 20,000 landmarks.
Restaurants, cinemas, theatres, embassies, post offices, police stations, prisons.
It's tough.
It's tough.
Dr. Eleanor McGuire did brain scans to measure the hippocampus of London cabbies before and after they learned the knowledge. In one study, she scanned 79 men who were just starting to learn the knowledge, and then again 3 to 4 years later.
We saw an enlarged posterior hippocampus. We're looking at changes in the order of maybe 10%.
It shrank back to normal after the taxi drivers retired, meaning you have to stay active to keep brain cells growing.
I think that is really encouraging for lifelong learning.
Have you had your own hippocampus measured?
I haven't. I'm very, very claustrophobic.
Do you know about the study about that the hippocampus of the brain grows bigger when you learn this?
I've heard of the hippocampus, yes. My wife gave a speech once and said, I'm okay, my husband's got a big hippocampus. So...
If you have a bigger hippocampus, your memory is better and you reduce your risk of dementia late in life. The things that shrink your hippocampus are obesity, diabetes, hypertension, insomnia, sleep apnea, stress, concussion. And the more of these you have, the more your brain will shrivel away.
So, what do we do to stimulate neurogenesis and get more brain cells?
Individuals can change their lifestyle.
The things that make your brain bigger are exercise, stress reduction, meditation, and a Mediterranean diet.
Vigorous walking, swimming, any of these kinds of exercise should be adequate to increase blood flow and increase the proliferation of cells. Every day I do some running, exercises, play squash periodically.
And constantly expose your brain to something new.
When we think of it in analogously would be traveling to new countries, learning a new language, learning a new video game.
And the wonderful weird part, you grow new brain cells even if you don't succeed at mastering a new activity.
If I take up trying to learn a new language, which I have a lot of difficulty, it's not whether I actually learn the language, it's the fact that I try to learn the language. That's going to do the trick. That's going to help them survive.
I think you're absolutely right. You've really gotten the essence of it. It's really the activity of utilizing the brain, exposing yourself to new important information. It's really the study of the new language that is helping things, not necessarily the endpoint of how well you learn it.
You can indeed turn the clock back when it comes to brain aging.
Dr. Fatui took 34 elderly patients with memory problems and put them on a regimen of diet, exercise, stress reduction, and brain training. Within 3 months, their hippocampus grew an average 3%. One woman's hippocampus grew 9%.
So somebody's hippocampus growing by 9% is equivalent of having a brain that's 18 years younger.
I was definitely up for having a younger brain.
You have done all the right things that I recommend to my patients.
Dr. Fatui suggested I keep doing what I have been doing, but he had even more suggestions.
There's no limit on how much we can improve our brain and our brain capacity.
He ordered a special MRI to see how much my brain and hippocampus have shrunk.
Don't try to escape.
The idea is I'll come back for another MRI to see if it grows bigger after several months of intensively following Dr. Fatoui's advice. I also got blood tests for nutritional deficiencies. I was alarmed to find a B12 deficiency, one of the worst for the brain, and I now get regular shots to correct it.
Oh, this is great.
My blood did have exceptionally high omega-3s.
This is from eating salmon. That's what puts all these omega-3s in your blood.
Studies show that people with high omega-3 tend to have a bigger hippocampus.
Excited.
And also people who eat blueberries. I generally eat a cup a day, and then a cup of coffee in the morning, lots of fruits and vegetables, olive oil, a little red wine, and no red meat. I'm making more trips to the dog park.
Oh,
And especially ramping up the exercise.
Exercise is the best way for you to grow new brain cells.
I want you to bring it up and I want you to
oh.
all the way around.
I began playing the Xbox. I get a big kick out of boxing. Dr. Fatoui suggested I might like juggling.
Okay.
I rounded up a few friends.
The fact is that there are brand new studies out showing that older people who learn to juggle actually increase the size of their brain.
There's always one in the front. I don't think.
I get it, sort of.
When we began our 30-year war on Alzheimer's, we thought it would be quick because we perceived the enemy as a lone sniper randomly taking potshots at elderly brains.
Maybe the enemy is not as simple and as simple-minded as we thought it was, that it's a lot more complex.
We now view the enemy as multiple hits to our brain throughout life, caused by lifestyle and environment, meaning they're potentially preventable.
I think people need to take personal responsibility on whether or not they develop dementia. Up to 80% of late-life cognitive decline has to do with your lifestyle choices.
Dr. Christine Yaffe is a 5-star general among the investigators of lifestyle and dementia. I ask her, which lifestyle factors make you most prone to dementia?
Depression, smoking, low educational achievement, physical inactivity, low cognitive stimulation, diabetes, obesity in midlife, strokes, cerebral vascular injuries, sleep disorders, bad diet, head injury, high blood pressure, vitamin deficiencies, low social engagement, post-traumatic stress disorder, low socioeconomic status, inappropriate medications, environmental toxins. Clinical depression could as much as double one's risk of having dementia. And the reason this is important, of course, is that depression can be treated. Sleep is a new risk factor. Things like insomnia, not being able to fall asleep, or waking up in the middle of the night.
People who have undiagnosed and untreated sleep apnea experience up to 18% shrinkage in the cortex and memory parts of the brain.
Obesity is another very important risk factor. Partially, it's because obesity often goes along with diabetes and high blood pressure and abnormal lipids, high cholesterol.
People who are overweight or obese have brains that are 8 or 16 years older.
In midlife, high blood pressure leads to increases of dementia, both vascular and Alzheimer's. The important things are to stay active, so physically active, mentally active, and to be very aware that the things that are involved for heart disease, the things you want to do to protect your heart are the same things you want to do to protect your brain.
I wonder, am I doing enough to prevent stroke and other vascular causes of dementia? I was shameless when I interviewed Dr. Claudia Kewas. I asked her to look at my brain scans to see how much vascular damage and shrinkage or atrophy I have.
The hallmark of an aging brain is atrophy.
So how does my atrophy look?
You have mild atrophy to my eyes. 70-year-old atrophy at most. I'd say it's normal elderly with some white matter changes that may represent small vessel disease or other things associated with aging.
Even personality traits relate to dementia.
One is neuroticism, which is the tendency to worry and be anxious and depressed. And higher levels of neuroticism predict faster cognitive decline.
The more you worry, the more
you're going to have something to worry about.
Yeah. Oh, good way.
Now, there's another personality trait called conscientiousness. And this one, the more the better. So conscientious people, they follow rules and regulations. They delay gratification in pursuit of long-term goals. It is related to slower cognitive decline and less chance of becoming demented. There's a third one called purpose in life. And purpose in life refers to individuals who see purpose in what they're doing. They have a larger plan. They decline less cognitively than to people with low purpose in life.
This is a personality trait, though, that we should assume they were born with?
Personality is not fixed in youth, as we used to think. It naturally does change during life.
Of course, I took the personality tests. I came out low in neuroticism, high in conscientiousness, and purpose in life.
Have you taken these personality tests yourself?
Of course not.
I think purpose in life matters.
What's your purpose in life?
I used to hope my purpose in life was going to be to help find a good treatment or cure for Alzheimer's disease. Now I just want to find out anything I can to make life better for all of us as we age.
My purpose in life is doing this documentary.
Good, good, good.
I sometimes seriously wonder if the detriment to my brain from the stress is outweighing the benefits of the mental stimulation. I contacted a top expert about relieving stress with meditation.
Meditation lowers cortisol levels in the blood. Cortisol is a hormone that comes from the adrenal gland in response to stress, and it kills memory cells by the millions. So stress leads to cognitive decline. That's the answer right there. You just prevent stress and with meditation. We've been studying a meditation from the yoga type of work called Kirtan Kriya. It only takes 12 minutes.
In one study, Dr. Kalsa found that meditation rejuvenated aging brains.
The average age was around 60, and they came for the study, and it was scientifically proven that they reversed their memory loss in 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks and had better looking scans, after doing the meditation.
So you could see structural changes on their brain scan as a result of doing meditation for 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks.
It lit up like a Christmas tree.
That's just amazing. You have to show me how to do this.
Okay. There are 4 sounds: sa, ta, na, ma. Each time you say the sound with me singing it, you're going to be touching the thumb to each finger in sequence. So it's sa, ta, na, ma. Sa, ta, na, ma. It's good before you have the coffee to sit and tune into yourself and do the Kirtan Kriya and build yourself a great brain.
And I won't get Alzheimer's.
Totally not. I hope not. You won't get Alzheimer's, yes.
Even though I have the major gene for Alzheimer's.
You will negate that gene with Kirtan Kriya. You will negate that gene with Kirtan Kriya.
That's possible too, isn't it? That's what happens.
Yeah.
You negate that gene.
That's it.
I think I'm negating the gene,
To everything that you're doing.
Yeah.
This documentary began with grim predictions of an Alzheimer's and dementia epidemic. The warnings continue to be alarming.
people think there will be a doomsday scenario in which everybody develops dementia and the world falls apart.
But how credible are these predictions?
The numbers that are flashed around, thousands and thousands of people will have Alzheimer's by AD 2050 or something like that, is we have no idea. That's just, you just pull that out of the air. And predictions like that are used deliberately to try and scare us all into action of one kind or another. Well, they're intended to raise money. And a doom scenario, a scary scenario, helps to raise money.
The statistic that scared me most is that half of all 80 to 85-year-olds will have Alzheimer's. Dr. Ron Peterson, who diagnosed President Reagan's Alzheimer's, used the figure in Parade magazine. And, oh my, it got in my book too. About half of all people over age 85 have Alzheimer's. I need to retract it. It's grossly exaggerated. After 25 years, the Alzheimer's Association now says that only 1/3 of Americans over age 85 have Alzheimer's. In a group of white women in California over age 85, only 18% of them had dementia. Then it's often said that anybody can get Alzheimer's or dementia, that it chooses its victims randomly, democratically, without distinction for sex, color, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. In reality, it is decidedly prejudiced. Dr. Kenneth Longa is a leading expert on who's likely to get dementia. Surprisingly, he says, it's strongly tied to race and socioeconomic factors.
The risk of dementia for a white person was 10%, for a Hispanic person about 17%, and for other race about 18%. About 12% for women compared to about 9% for men.
Education is a powerful deterrent to dementia.
Every year of additional education through life seems to improve your cognitive reserve and decrease your dementia risk.
A high school dropout is 2.5 times more apt to have dementia than someone who attends college. How much money you make influences your odds of dementia. If your family earns under $15,000 a year, you're 4.5 times more apt to have dementia than somebody in a family earning $75,000 or more.
That's right. Yep. We think it's not just the money differences that's causing those differences, but other things that go along with it. Things like differences in education, differences perhaps in access to health care and health behaviors, and the stresses that go along with being poor.
There is one prediction everybody agrees on. The number of old people is dramatically rising.
There's about 600 million people who are 65 and older now, and that's going to rise to almost 1.5 billion by 2050. The number of people with dementia, we think, almost definitely will be rising over the next 40 years.
Simply because there are more elderly people.
The thinking about the epidemic is that everyone will be at higher and higher risk.
Then came an amazing surprise. New studies showing that your own individual chances of dementia and Alzheimer's are not going up. They're going down. All we ever hear, mostly, is how it's all going up. It's rising dramatically. It's going to be the end of the world. We're going to have all this. That's going down?
So a 75-year-old today, we think, has a lower risk of dementia than a 75-year-old did 20 years ago here in the United States.
How much lower?
In the 24% or 25% relative decrease, because there'll be so many more people at risk because of the large growth in the population.
So in raw numbers, we may have more.
Correct.
But individually, this is amazing that our own particular individual risk is going down.
Declining.
That's what people really want to know, don't they?
That's right. I think individuals, that's what they care most about.
My risk is probably 20, 25% less
than an 82-year-old 10, 20 years ago?
Say 20 years ago, yeah, in that range.
It's also happening in other affluent countries. England.
It's a reduction of around 20%.
Were you surprised?
I was surprised, yes.
The Netherlands.
And that estimate was that we had a 25% risk reduction.
Sweden.
That the incidence of dementia is decreasing.
At a rate of 3% a year, 30% a decade. In Boston, the dementia rates of people in the Framingham Heart Study dropped dramatically over the last 3 decades.
A reduction of 22%, 38%, and 44%.
And most striking, MRI scans show that today's elderly brains are larger with less disease.
Less brain atrophy, had less small vessel pathology, so their brains actually looked younger, healthier.
Brains are looking younger, right, so the 75 is the new 65 for brains.
How could this be? In the middle of a predicted epidemic, an astonishing reversal in our old age dementia rates.
Now, what that means is that lifestyle has made a huge impact.
Mainly because people have higher levels of education, and we seem to be doing a better job of controlling these cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension and high cholesterol and diabetes, and we think that's what's decreasing the risk.
We can delay the onset of symptoms by 10, 20 years. It is possible to move Shakespeare's 7th decade to 8th or 9th or 10th decade.
Our changing lifestyle is changing our brains and postponing the onset of dementia. Now, it's time to find out what my brain scan shows. Telling me the results is Dr. Sam Gandy, one of the rock stars of Alzheimer's research.
Am I going to be very upset?
Well, it depends on what upsets you.
Okay.
This says normal amyloid brain PET scan.
What does that mean?
That means there's no evidence of Alzheimer's disease.
What?
You disappointed?
No.
You're the
Wait a
first
minute.
person I've guessed that had a normal scan who looked disappointed.
Wait a minute. I just want to understand before I get too excited about this. Are you saying that I took this PET scan to look for amyloid plaque in my brain, which is what the scan shows, and you didn't find very much?
There's no evidence of plaque in your brain.
I am 80 years old. I have an ApoE4 gene. How is it possible that I do not have a lot of amyloid plaque in my brain?
Well, presumably you also have protective genes as well that are keeping the amyloid level low or undetectable. Either that or, there's evidence that physical exercise, social engagement, mental activity can neutralize the effects of ApoE4. Can reverse the positive amyloid scans. So
I do a lot of that.
You may be just fighting it off well. It may be either genetic or your lifestyle.
I'm amazed.
Well, it is what it is.
Good job. Good job. You've been doing something right.
Welcome to Shangri-La.
Yes, our dementia epidemic is still on the horizon, but it doesn't look as big or personally terrifying as predicted. So, we have not found a pharmaceutical atomic bomb to end dementia, but our silent underground war that virtually nobody knew existed has been remarkably successful. Me, I'm just still trying every day to make my brain bigger. But I haven't yet had the nerve to have another MRI measurement done to see if it is. Maybe in a few months. And I've enrolled in a new ApoE4 study to find out whether it is genes or lifestyle apparently keeping my brain somewhat safer. Still, even though I'm unlikely to get Alzheimer's, I know There are many other monsters waiting out there. But I never dream about Dr. Alzheimer anymore.